Mm-hmm. I'll go to immediately. You can open the chat.
Joining here, we can just perhaps do our typical announcements, if that sounds okay, because it's a busy week at the workshop, which is really exciting. So just as a quick reminder, this Wednesday, we have a two-parter, right? With Eric, very gladly, I'm very thrilled, frankly, that you're able to make the trip down, Eric. He's going to be participating in the research series in the Ostrom Book Club, talking about his new book, The Uncommon Knowledge of Elinor Ostrom, Essential Lessons for Collective Action. So that's going to be 12-1. So make sure to tune in for that. And then later that same afternoon, so from 2 to 3 o'clock on Wednesday, we're going to have Ann McKinnon and Bill Blomquist talking about a really, really cool project on water governance in the rural American West. And another great book, The Public Waters Lessons from Wyoming for the American West. So really wonderful discussions around water governance. Of course, INZA is going to be very involved in that. And I encourage everybody, hopefully, I know it's a very busy time of year, but if you can, to be sure to either attend both events, live, or be sure to stream them if you can after the fact. They'll be available per usual on the workshop's YouTube channel. Thanks to all of your hard work on that front, David. So those are just a few other events coming up this week. But first, we are really, really excited to have another banner colloque teed up for all of you today with Gareth Hayson. Thank you so much for joining, Gareth, from the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town. And Jordan Blecking is very kindly moderating and leading this discussion. So Jordan, thank you so much for doing that. And I'm going to be down in just a moment. So I'll see you there, okay?
That sounds good. That sounds good. Thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. Maybe some folks it's the morning, certainly for Gareth it's the evening. But my name is Jordan Blecking. I'm a graduate or PhD candidate actually in the Department of Geography and a researcher at the Sustainable Food Systems Science Initiative here on campus. And we're very excited to have today with us Dr. Gareth Hayson, who's an urbanist whose work uses food as a lens to investigate the rapid urban transitions taking place in African and Southern cities. Gareth is a researcher in the Urban Food Systems Research Cluster at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, as Scott mentioned. And since 2011, Gareth has maintained an association with the African Food Security Urban Network. His most recent published work argued for integrating food-sensitive planning into urban governance initiatives. But my personal work of his was published in Food Policy and examines why it's so difficult to measure food security in urban areas. And I know that he'll be touching on a little bit of that today. So I'm excited to hear about that personally. And then lastly, Gareth holds a PhD from the University of Cape Town and a Master of Philosophy from Stellenbosch University. And with that, we'll turn it over to Gareth to present. So please welcome Dr. Gareth Hayson.
Thank you, Jordan, and thanks so much. And yeah, and thank you. It's a great privilege to be here and be able to speak in this space. I hope what I present is of interest, if not parts of it, of a piece of work that Jordan and I are working on that is sort of emergent, if I can call it that. So you'll not necessarily have completely formed ideas. And if you bear with us through the sort of discussion of trying to perhaps cobble or crochet a few things together, it's still rather loose. But hopefully it'll create some conversation and we can engage in this. I'll share my screen. Jordan, just to check, can you see?
Yep, it looks great.
See that? Thank you. All right, so I think as Jordan mentioned, having worked with the African Food Security Urban Network since 2011, a project that started way back in 2007, 2008, and a number of other projects that have used various different entry points to try and understand food in cities. Unlike some in the food group in the introductions earlier, I don't have an agronomy or necessarily a food systems background, but I spent 15 years working in the sort of private sector of the food system and then returned to academia. So this body of work is something that has evolved over a period of time, but takes a very specific African and urban lens to try and understand some of the processes going on and ask questions about some certain assumptions that might be held about certain specific positions, etc. But for us, a particularly interesting piece of work emerged from David Smith, kind of raising a question around how the urban food question was being addressed. This is, as you can see, from 1998, and really challenged sort of preceding 2 decades, particularly following the Habitat conferences around cities and sort of urbanization challenge, and made this point that cities and food weren't necessarily connected, and that there was this disjuncture despite these global debates taking place. And I think our work shows this playing out, and so it's been sort of using this as a sort of pretext to the work that we started to do. And it's also about engaging in this. This is the context, as David Smith mentioned. You know, there's often plenty of food available. It's how that food, the utilization components, how it's accessed, how the economy enables that. This continuum between highly formal, the globalized food system, as one can see from the Coca-Cola sort of branding on the various different shops, right down to the local sort of bright red tomatoes that are sold because they're going to be consumed this evening, and not those funny green tomatoes one might see in a supermarket shelf. And what that means across this continuum, and how do you understand this? How do you engage it? And as Jordan mentioned, using food as a lens to try and interrogate these particular contexts, obviously different across many cities. This is Epworth. Some might not even consider it a city of about 180,000 people on the outskirts of Harare, but there are many others across the African continent. And so what our paper tries to do is tries to sort of stitch these 3 different components together, really to be quite specific about Africa's urban transition and what that might mean, to accept and recognize Barry Popkins and others' notion of this nutrition transition, to say that yes, it is certainly taking place, but to ask questions around what does it mean when these 2 transitions connect, and is something different happening? And do we need to ask deeper questions around these processes? But equally, in that intersection of those 2 different transitions, how is society engaging in this, in the socio-material components of making life in this hustle of an African city? And what does that mean? And then lastly, how do we measure that? And are the current measurement approaches adequately capturing what is going on? And if we're not capturing it effectively, what does that then mean for how policy is being framed, how we're programming responses, how international donor organizations might respond to assumed crises, and what is actually driving this? But equally, what is the scale of focus and attention? And so how do these components all come together and sort of intersect? And so we try to sort of connect those, as I say, in the paper. Very briefly, this is not new to anyone, but I think it's often worth just reminding ourselves of this challenge, in that, you know, the first urban transition took 200 years. In that period, the modern systems of governance, all those structures were developed. But the global north took these 200 years to sort of achieve a sort of 50% urban component, and that accounted for about sort of 500 million people. Conversely, the second urban transition that's taking place across the global south is going to taking place in a period of about 8 years will achieve that 50% urban sort of profile. And that would be almost 4 billion people living in cities at that time. The global north were able to achieve that transition thanks to the global south, the colonies and the extractive nature of that, but equally grow their economic opportunities within that. But equally, from a sustainability point of view, there was no concern over using the globe as the sink for that industrial generation. The global south doesn't have that opportunity. We're working in a climate constrained and sustainability constrained environment, but equally, there isn't that economic growth that is possible through industrialization across the south. And while some might be experiencing a measure of industrialization, Africa isn't necessarily doing that. So the 3 points for me and how we framed this in this paper is that the scale is unprecedented across Africa of that urban transition. The economy, but equally housing, the lived environment, the built environment, and development is largely informal, contingent, being made up almost every day. And it's an incredibly youthful population. The 2020 sort of median was under 20 years of age, and that's only going to get younger as time goes by. So what does that mean for how this transitioning process intersects with the nutrition transition? And as my colleague Edgar Peterson writes, because of this rapid rise in urbanization, one of the key components of this is investment in infrastructure. We're seeing so-called Silk Road urbanization, as some have called it, industrialization, sort of focusing on the cities, trying to invest heavily in urban development, specifically in urban infrastructure, sort of redundancy sort of infrastructure, where the kind of infrastructures of the global north that are now falling out of favor for more sustainable processes are being transferred into Africa. And this focus on infrastructure means that in the next 20 years, the infrastructure that will be built in Africa is potentially going to, or certainly in African cities, is going to influence Africa's wider infrastructure development. And not only that, it's wider sustainability over the continent for perhaps the next 100 years. And given the sort of carbon, the climate crisis, etc., that we might face, it might even have global ramifications. So getting cities and infrastructure right is a critical kind of area of focus for us. Again, this is the city, the informal, the contingent, having to make multiple networks, where governance, as we might know it, around paved areas and everything doesn't necessarily play out. The young child on the mother's back, the absence of places for creches, etc., and how nutrition and food system functions in those spaces. So speaking of the nutrition transition, again, going back to the late 90s, and Barry Popkin and others kind of framed this nutrition and linked it to the sort of rise of urbanization and the accumulation of wealth in a sort of framing of what urban enabled in much earlier times. That as people urbanized, they became more wealthy and affluent, and this created a shift in diets. The diets are definitely shifting, and they are becoming more urban. There is this sort of move away from coarse grains to more processed foods, etc. But we want to sort of delve into this a little bit more and ask some questions around what this might mean and how is this playing out? And is this urban transition taking place as a desire for more Western diets? Or is there something else driving some of these processes that are playing out? Equally, Karina Hawkes from City University in London, and one of the earlier kind of guides of the Global Nutrition Report, links urbanization and globalization to kind of as drivers of this nutrition transition. And we see it, again, the sugar sweetened beverage deliveries making able to get into areas that most others aren't able to do that, but also how global trade agreements and food policies, etc., are all intersecting to fundamentally shift this food system. And a bit of earlier work also, this need to differentiate between dietary convergence, which is this kind of narrowing of the diets and a focus on staples, meat, and certain dairy products and oils and the sort of highly processed food, but equally this dietary adaptation taking place where there's a shift to more globalized diets and sort of the brand names and things like that, and how these two intersect and play out within one another. And so, again, just to reiterate, we're not saying that this nutrition transition isn't taking place, but whether this is taking place as a result of a desire to move to Western diets and as a result of sort of lack of exercise and the lack of mobility, or if something else is playing out in these African cities, given the limited sort of economic opportunities and the high levels of informality. And so again, this is a Kenyan town of Kisumu. What is interesting for me is this is a scene that many of you who worked across the African continent would have seen in many of the spaces. Sort of the women, informal traders selling the collard greens, the to make spuma wiki later in the evening, or sort of selling informally, but equally globalized food, selling ultra-processed products on the billboards. And why are these both able to intersect into these spaces? What is driving this? Why is there such palatability, to use a food metaphor, for these ultra-processed products? And what is causing that in these sites where one can see these multiple forms of infrastructure playing out? And so what we've done and what we've included in our surveys that we've done across these, we've included a form of multidimensional poverty or a survey to ask questions about that as a module. And here I've just taken some of the secondary cities we've worked in, Kisumu, Kitwe, and Zambia, and Epworth. And for us, what's important, we ask how often in the last year did you go without fuel to cook your food, and water for household use, and then food. And you see across all of them, there are these sort of grades of sort of deprivation, but several times, many times, and always is happening quite frequently. And the reason we use this is the Live Poverty Index, this form of multidimensional poverty measure, is to try and find out how the food system is connecting into the urban system, and to try and connect these two rapidly changing systems in our survey work. Equally, Bruce Frayne and Cameron McCordick, in their assessment of the earlier AFSUN surveys done in 2007 and 2008, found a significant higher propensity to suffer high levels of food insecurity if you had a high multidimensional poverty scores, particularly in terms of the poverty index. But equally, your kind of stability of your food supply was also kind of far more kind of precarious. And so for us in our engagement in these cities, what we're finding is it's these infrastructures that are playing a far greater role than what is generally understood to be driving food systems or food choices in these cities. We have found through all our survey work, for mostly the qualitative interviews that we do, is that if one doesn't trust the water supply that is being provided, you will make a strategic choice to drink a sugar-sweetened beverage. When you have to sort of pay for hijacked electricity through some kind of intermediary where you're paying 2 to 3 times more the price for that electricity, you'll be very cautious about cooking a traditional food source that will require many hours of cooking, like grains and things like that. The 2-minute, 3-minute noodles become highly attractive. Equally, when you're living in a shack settlement where open electricity is around, the risk of fire and things are far greater, and you can reduce that risk in a strategic way by boiling a kettle simply and cooking for a very short time. The same applies for transport. When black bodies were located on the peripheries and sort of sanitation zones outside the city, the colonial cities, and those settlements still exist, people have to travel long distances, often in sort of informal types of transport to get into town. And the same for living in a shack settlement where the benefits of bulk purchasing from a supermarket are negated by the fact that there's no storage, these things don't play out. So it's these infrastructures in the built environment that are playing a far greater role in the food system than is often assumed or articulated. And so our argument in the paper and what we present is saying that households with poor access to unreliable energy, water, and related services are making choices aligned to the infrastructure options and not necessarily to food. The choice to go for the parboiled rice or the ultra-processed bread that will have an extended shelf life, or the tinned food with high levels of sugar and salts, is not because of taste necessarily. It's because that food is a strategic choice that reduces other costs that are not food related to the costs, but they're related to the cost of infrastructure, time costs, and other things. So we say these households are making a choice. It's not driven by a desire for Western diets or ignorance, as some of the health policies, even in South Africa, articulate. These are not defectless poor. They're making a pragmatic strategic choice as a result of these very poor services and infrastructure deficiencies. And so this agency that is playing out in the paper we draw on other components around this, arguing that, you know, this is about this dance between thinking forward, looking back, and making a strategic decision in the current, in the here and now. And so whilst the sort of framing of the nutrition transition has been kind of connected, this connection between urbanization and globalization, driving this dietary convergence and adaptation, and how this is playing into how food is measured, and we're sort of pretty good at understanding how to measure that, although in the urban space it's missing. What we argue is that the second urban transition and globalization is connecting in ways that are perhaps quite a lot more challenging. We don't understand this. For the upwardly mobile and those with income and wealth, it's perhaps what has been articulated. And even though Barry Kopkin has challenged how much the nutrition community has started to frame some of this, asking for greater nuance, drawing on the work of others in the space around the sort of level of engagement in that and the depth of engagement in this. We argue that for the poor, there is a very different set of drivers driving this nutrition transition, and how the poor are making strategic choices, how they've agency, how they're deciding what to do in these spaces, how they are trying to make these strategic decisions is not particularly well understood. And our measurement strategies and approaches are not able to adequately capture this. These can't be captured in these big surveys that one might do. We need far greater nuance, more qualitative work. This integration of multiple different research approaches are necessary. And this is particularly important because for us, given this transition to a majority urban world, given the sort of impact that infrastructure and development might have on generating these path dependencies going forward, given this important need to descale food security and food systems governance from the national scale where it's traditionally sat right down to the urban scale, we need to be able to understand these things in far greater detail. We need to be able to have effective data and information in order to direct policies at these urban scales, which are varied across everywhere. So for us, the urban scale and urban scale food governance is a critical component. This is not to disregard the rural or disregard rural sort of food systems work. It's to say that we need to have a specific and deliberate focus on the urban. And city regionalism, the urban-rural transfers are all important, but what happens in that domain in which politics takes place, and how do you work within that? And we need to really understand what is driving this nutrition transition, because our sense is to blame the poor for these poor choices when they are making very strategic choices informed by a very problematic urban condition is something that we need to be able to articulate far better. When we have things like the Sustainable Development Goals, directing measurement and directing our understanding way back towards the rural, around a very limited way of measuring it, it doesn't connect with the SDG 11 and those sort of things, we start to have problems. But understanding the voice, agency, and how the poor are making everyday work and the decisions they're making is equally important in that policy framing. So let me leave it there and just say thank you. And hopefully I kept within the time, Jordan, for the messages, but thank you. I'll stop sharing and open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you, Gareth. Yeah, so with that, let's open it up for some questions. I did see Julia asked, Gareth, could you quickly recap what dietary convergence is?
So yeah, so this convergence of diet, where the diets from what were traditionally diets of sort of coarse grains and more rural foods, the diets will then converge to become reduced. And we see this, and in the paper we present the sort of dietary diversity scores where we take these 12 food groups, reducing right down to 4 and 5 in some of the cities. So eating a staple grain, shima in Zambia, ugali in Kenya, elsewhere, maybe some collard greens, sukuma wiki, often then supplemented with tea and coffee and maybe even crisps and other things, often flavored with ultra-processed sort of stock cubes and things like that. But this convergence of the diet from a very diverse rural diet of seasonal grains, millets, etc., to this very narrow, often ultra-processed food that kind of comes in that component, if that helps clarify.
While we wait to see if anyone else has some extra questions, one thing I wanted to ask Gareth is how would we go about operationalizing agency? Like how can we actually start to measure it? If so much of what you've talked about is that there is a challenge in measuring this nutrition transition and kind of the infrastructure within urban areas, and agency has now been added as a component that we need to think about in addition to availability, accessibility, stability, and utilization. How can we start to kind of operationalize that?
It's a great question, Jordan, and it's a question that we're grappling with. And I think for me, there are these multiple definitions of agency, and the way the high-level panel of experts has defined this is kind of drawn on Sen's work about the ability to choose and how one makes those choices. First, it presents a problem of how is that choice being influenced by global marketing and things like that, but equally how is place and context influencing certain choices. For us, what we have started doing is actually shift the sort of research method completely. And this is quite difficult in terms of how one then starts to generalize around that. But we've been working with very close communities, doing detailed work, trying to understand the food system, doing what we call sort of learning journeys, going through, engaging with society, trying to understand things, transect walks, the likes, trying to actually engage in what's happening, asking people to point out things, playing the role of a provocateur as well. So assuming that some things might be normalized. So the daily struggle might have been something that has been done for 10, 20 years, and that's how that food system functions. And so asking deeper questions, bringing outside voices in, bringing in multiple disciplines. The team I work at the moment has historians, geographers, nutritionists, GIS specialists, public health anthropologists, and trying to use those groupings to start working in a multidisciplinary way with, in our case, we're working with mothers who have children under the age of 5 or are pregnant, or mothers who are pregnant, and trying to understand how they in that particular grouping are navigating the food system and how their choices are being made, and then documenting that and having other processes where we use imagery and others to provoke and have conversations. So very much more in-depth qualitative work, but overlaying that with the quantitative work and overlaying that with other forms of data to try and build a sort of composite approach. By no means perfect, but it needs to be done, and it shows the sort of specificity of context as well. So a long-winded answer, Jordan, I'll stop it there. I can go into it later as well, but one approach certainly.
Yeah, I love that response. It's by no means perfect, but it's a marginal improvement and a step in the right direction. In the queue, we have Eric and then Bernie.
Oh, sorry, Eric, I think you're still muted.
Or else his microphone isn't working.
Can they hear me?
No, I don't think so.
If it's okay, Eric, maybe we'll come back to you and turn to Bernie first. Is that all right?
Yeah, this is Bernie. So I was wondering, this decision-making process for procuring food by individuals, is there a comparable decision process beyond food in Africa? That is this broader than just food, or is this a unique, just a food system?
So, I mean, we are seeing this certainly in terms of water, how people might access water, and there's a lot more work happening in Cape Town around sort of societal kind of water governance that played out during the drought. And I'll direct you to the work of Gina Ziervogel, who did some very interesting work on that around water during our drought, where we sort of sat with the specter of day zero around how society sort of started to mobilize, how there were sort of sticks and carrots to try and drive that, but how people were making decisions around that. Charlotte Lemansky has recently written on the sort of inequalities around some of this that has played out. So how in the drought in Cape Town, how the wealthy were able to put in boreholes and the poor with severe risk to the ecology and the aquifers, while the poor had to carry on and sort of do certain things. So it's not just confined to the poor, there are these different things playing out. We're seeing it in other ways in terms of access to land in some places, but not as prominently as this, but these sort of multiple sort of decision-making processes that do play out. It is also evident around certain public health components, where people are making certain decisions around that linked to certain aspects and making compromises in that respect. But yeah, so there are some, they're not all the same. Food is where I've looked at it. I'll continue to think, Bernie, about others, and if they do come to mind, I'll certainly mention them now. But yeah, transport is another way, but it's been largely formalized, informalized through the sort of paratransit sort of systems.
Thank you. That's just what I was thinking about. This is not unique just to food, even though food's a big enough topic to study by itself.
We'll go back to Eric.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I can.
Yes. Okay. So my question was about the intersection. Thank you very much. This is a very thought-provoking paper. And so my question is about the intersection of the nutritional transition that you talked about and the energy transition among households, especially in the informal settlements in urban Africa. There's an idea like the energy ladder, in which households are moving from wood fuels to charcoal, up to like gas stoves and even electricity and electric kettles and things like that. So can you talk a little bit more about that, how this energy transition intersects with the choices of foods that people are making, and some of the challenges associated with that? I think you touched on it a little bit with the noodles and the electric kettle, but if you could expand more on that.
So this is definitely playing out, and it happens in multiple folds. So what was really useful in Epworth is we did a GIS mapping of vegetation in the settlement, and we mapped the decline in vegetation and the rising cost of energy. And so where energy was, and the changes in foods chosen over that period of time. So as the freely available energy that was being harvested reduced, we saw the foods change as people moved to foods that didn't require that, where the energy cost then started to add to that and started to undermine the variety of foods, etc., that were available. Equally, what we're seeing is, rather than energy sort of ladder, we're seeing what we call energy stacking. So we see different forms of energy being used for different uses. So in the qualitative work I was describing to Jordan, we found that when it's a really cold day, people will cook a porridge or something that requires longer to cook, and they'll cook it on a primer stove, because that sort of kerosene type stove will also heat up the rest of the house. Whereas when it's a warm day, we don't need the warmth, so we'll rather might even go outside and buy it outside from a street vendor. So we're seeing it taking place in the household, but it's also extending externally to street vendors and foods being prepared on the street, linked in a way also to transit. So if the child gets up at 4 a.m. in the morning, they might then buy a mandazi or something like that, a Rolex, nearer the school, and so they'll buy something that has a different energy to what the household energy might be in its preparation. And so this notion of stacking, rather than this clean trajectory from a dirty fuel to a cleaner fuel, is what is evident. And it's a useful way to use food to try and interrogate that. However, it gets even more complicated, and now the last moment is when culture and taste come in. Yes. So in Zambia, as Jordan will know, speaking to some anthropologists, they said, whatever you do when you do this research work, please don't tell us to make another kind of clean energy mbala. People like the taste on the dirty charcoal. They don't want the clean energy. So there's this kind of link to taste and culture, as the same with the barbecue. And so how those tastes and choices around culture and taste intersect with an energy transition. There are many PhDs in that, if I can just say that as a cheap, short answer to that, if that answers your question in some way.
Yes, thank you very much.
I just want to add that they are correct. It is better on the charcoal than on the clean. So even I agree. Next we'll have Sully and then Kurt.
Okay, so thank you very much for your presentation. My question is about dietary convergence. So these people coming from rural areas migrating to urban areas, I was wondering if these people settle around communities consisting of their fellow countrymen, so consisting of people from their own village or from their own region who have enough resources to, continue producing their local products, can lead to maintaining diversity in food choices. Thank you.
So Sully, thanks. And I think context is, again, really important in how we kind of frame this. So considering, but like, you're back in Turkey, different regions might have different histories and different processes. But for us, what we're seeing is in South Africa, given our sort of the way in which the economy was structured and the extractive nature of industry and the sort of homeland systems, etc., those urban-rural linkages to more traditional food from remittances aren't necessarily as strong. People are still congregating around clan and culture and kin when they move into the urban area, in areas where they have networks and know people, but that doesn't necessarily change how food migrates from those areas. However, in places like Kenya or in Zambia, it is far more pronounced, and we are seeing these traditional foods coming in, the traditional grains, the millets, etc. In Namibia, it's the same, moving down from the north, where there's more productive areas in the sort of northern, in that sort of Kalahari transit zone. Often meats and things like that that are coming from that area come down into the city, into these different areas. So in different cities, it is different, but that gets overlaid with this rise of big food and the processed foods that come in. And when the time and the other considerations that drive the preparation of that food become so expensive, that convergence starts to sort of well, that divergence converges and becomes reduced in terms of what gets consumed from what we're finding. But it's also an area where far more work needs to be done. I'll direct you to some early work by Bruce Frayne in Namibia, who looked at those remittances coming from the north into Windhoek and has looked at some of those processes. But we, interestingly, in South Africa, see a kind of resistance to that happening with foreign migrants who are bringing fruits to their home country. So a slightly different motivation around a connection back. And in certain countries, it's linking back to bushmeat and things like that for want of getting the energy from the forests and those sort of things. So again, different reasons for that. But yes, it is certainly playing out.
Great. Kurt?
Hi, Gareth. Thanks for the talk. It sounds like in a lot of ways you're saying that governance is not really keeping up with urbanization and the nutritional transition. I'm sort of wondering if you can point to places, to presumably small cities where there's sort of an Ostrom-like community governance of urban food systems going on. I mean, are there places that that you could point to that sort of buck this trend a bit, or is this sort of pervasive and tied into larger issues of governance and capacity?
Yeah, it's another line to the work that I've been doing, is trying to understand sort of emerging forms of governance in these spaces and what they might be. I certainly see it in certain parts of the food system. So the informal economy has a very interesting and I suppose Ostrom-like way of kind of emerging and engaging and developing things. Some perhaps not as savory, there are gatekeepers, but there are others that try to sort of enable a level of governance that takes place. The COVID-19 pandemic in Cape Town certainly precipitated a very interesting process. And I can send the links on if you like. The community foods, we had this community action networks, which linked a wealthier community to a poorer community to try in the COVID lockdowns, when there was absolutely no food, no work taking place, and there was extreme hunger, happened very, very fast. The sort of 9 meals away from hunger really started to play out. And these groups connected, and those groups have come together to try and think through an alternative version of food systems governance and try to think through governance in a very different way, in a more pluralistic way, to use sort of Rob McRae and Donahue's work around how that might play out around the sort of food policy councils that one might see elsewhere. I think there is an interesting challenge in the African context where we've had such a history of colonialism, sort of patriarchy and other things which often silence certain voices. So that ability for that agency to emerge is not necessarily always there. It's not that it's not there, it stays in very confined groups necessarily. And so the challenge in this Cape Town work that I've been sort of part of myself, is how we find equity, how we find spaces in which people can converse in a safer space where they can start to develop more community level governance structures around certain things. There are places where it's starting and where it's evident, but it's often undermined by other processes and other politics, but it's sort of hanging on by the fingernails and really trying to emerge and trying to sort of work its way through that system, but it's not as prominent. And it's something that we've been looking at around a sort of a move away from the top-down sort of city-centered government governance and trying to understand how governance can play out. There are some urban agriculture groups and things like that that might sort of drive those processes, but nothing kind of as prominent as that. It is evident in the water space again. They have water user committees and things like that that are formally constituted, but not as much in the food space at this time, if that answers a sort of question, perhaps not quite completely.
Sorry, I was muted. I was going to just say we found examples of kind of this bottom-up approach in Lusaka, and I think a lot of cities where there are traditional markets, they have kind of circumvented the role of the central government or the local government to enact their own governance structures surrounding food. But yeah, as Gareth is saying, it's more localized examples, I think.
And Jordan, if I can just add to that, I mean, one of the things that one has to sort of consider always is how politics plays out. So often in these countries like Lusaka, public meetings, the only real public spaces are the markets. And so this is where things start to play out and are often, yeah, but anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Stacy and then Wes.
Thank you, Gareth. Good to have you here. And thank you, Jordan. My question might have been covered a little bit by what Kurt was just asking, but like Bernie was saying, you know, people facing food insecurity, having to make decisions in these trade-offs, this happens all over the world. And so, yes, of course, this is a very specific kind of context, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts about, in terms of policy, if there are lessons to be learned from other parts of the world that have already had to kind of either just help people manage these decisions and these trade-offs, or perhaps dealing with urbanization in this kind of a context, if there are things that we should either look to or definitely not look to when thinking about policy going forward.
So thanks, and thank you, Stacey. I mean, it's a question that has kind of, we've tried to understand quite deeply. And so studied Belo Horizonte and studied the sort of processes that have played out in Bogota and elsewhere, and how those are being constructed. I was fortunate enough to spend a bit of time with Cecilia Rocha, who studied the Belo Horizonte story quite closely, to try and understand these processes and how they connect into a wider set of processes. And so there are others where the state has played a far greater role. Currently, I'm working in Bangalore with partners at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. And what is very interesting in the Bangalore food security results are far higher, and trying to understand how that plays out. And it certainly appears to be a connection between the sort of charity shops, the Hopcoms, the PDS, the public distribution system that enable a form of social protection that enables access to certain things, but equally how the market has not been as captured by the sort of large consolidated players. And so there are these different components. There is also, and I suppose it answers Kurt's question and as well, a different community solidarity, a different level of giving that might come from other cultures where people who are hungry who ask will be given food. And so there are these different intersecting kind of components that play into that. Admittedly, Bangalore is a different city to the rest of India, so I'm speaking specifically to Bangalore. My work in Wardha in the central India near Nagpur, there were high levels of food insecurity there, measured more observationally through my time that I spent there with students. So I think there are these different processes that play out. Interestingly, in China, we did work in Nanjing. And in Nanjing, and this is part of the work that prompted us around spatial planning, was they have what they call this creeping peg. So if any development, be it city or private developer, extends beyond a certain percentage of urban residents, they're obligated in that land that they're using to put in a wet market. And again, not the Wuhan type wet market that we might have been anxious about with COVID. These are, they look, refrigerated areas, high levels of sophistication, very well managed from a food and health and safety point of view, that these become daily sites of which fresh greens are purchased. And because they connect directly to the producers, they're not going through multiple middle kind of actors. And so you don't have the sort of markups being paid on that lot. So again, in Nanjing, yes, the economy is very different to most elsewhere in Africa, but very high levels of food security noted, high levels of dietary diversity. So I think at the urban scale, they can certainly play that role, as they did in Belo Horizonte with creating markets and popular restaurants and things like that to enable food access. But equally, there can be these structural drivers that force others or incentivize others who are being able to capture and build their economy to actually provide services that might enable higher levels of food security through those processes. And so how these come together, and so there are options. I think the governance question becomes an interesting question. It sits at how those are governed and how sort of continuity is embedded in that. So as we saw in Brazil with Bolsonaro, how those were undermined and how they can be retained, and becomes an interesting question.
Wes, you're next.
Yeah, thank you. I have a follow-up to your answer to Sully's question. And you got at this a little bit, but I'm curious if there's kind of more you could say. Are you seeing kind of this, so basically satisficing behavior in cities is leading people to more processed diets. Is that getting passed through rural supply chains to then change what farmers are growing in the non-city areas? Because if so, that seems like there might be a negative feedback loop there.
Yeah, so what it's a question, an area of work that I haven't done looking at what is being produced necessarily. So our work in Zambia, we asked vendors where they were getting their food from. And this might help if it's a slightly kind of more of a case to kind of present it to. And they reflected a very different supply chain. It was coming, global supply chain. They were getting fish from Namibia, they were getting fish from China, they were getting, fruit from South Africa, etc. Equally the same in Lake Victoria, the sort of traders, they were selling their local catch for a higher price into Nairobi, but they were importing for the local consumers from China through factory farmed fish. So there is diverse global food systems at play. I think what we in the South African context, the sort of there are traditional foods, the dambara nuts and things like that are coming in, mapani worms, but it's not on a scale that is diverse. Admittedly, the Southern African context, our histories have meant that sort of more traditional farmers aren't necessarily as their access to land, their tenure, the history of this possession has meant that they've been largely removed. Interestingly, in Zimbabwe, we found something that, and I should have mentioned this to Sully's question, what we found is this proliferation, and someone by the name of Percy Toriro has done a PhD in this. What he found was he was a planner, so he tracked the amount of sort of shigaos, hammer mills, these sort of small informal hammer mills that had been established. And he found over 140 of them. And so what this was people who'd been given access to land through the Zimbabwean land reform process, but didn't want to sell into large formalized systems. They were then setting up small retail options that would process their maize, as well as others who were bringing maize in and grind that maize on a daily basis, on demand and on the quantities needed, and service those processes. Equally, there were secondary industries making sort of maputi, a type of popcorn, and things like that kind of emerged as a result of these sites. So I think for me, the question here is how these sort of multiple kind of flows of food connect into how planning and policy is either enabled or not. These were happening in the town of Epworth that we looked at, not in Harare itself, because Harare's land governance and policing was far more sort of forceful, for want of a better description, than what might have happened in a largely informally governed settlement, town of Epworth. So there are these different specificities that play out. So to answer your question, whether there are negative feedback loops, I think yes and no. I think in places where this dietary convergence is taking place and where other things are not enabling that, it would be the case. And I think it's an area to look at in terms of, sort of farmer support processes, how support might be enabled around certain things. The Alliance for the Green Revolution and others are also sort of creating some challenges around that, and we're seeing farm consolidations, we're seeing sort of reductions in what's being grown, we're seeing a conversion to cash crops from more traditional crops. So how those all intersect with urban, I suppose why I'm blowing a few bubbles in trying to answer your question. I'm seeing some examples of some, but there are so many other factors that I think are influencing this that I'm battling to come up with a definitive yes, no, sort of more direct response, but I hope I've helped somewhat in that.
There's one question online in the chat. Wish I had glasses. Would it help if a local street vendor could announce their dish of the day on a cell phone app? In other words, have you seen any digital solutions growing up in the wild?
Yes, definitely. WhatsApp, M-Pesa, all these things are becoming incredible platforms which people are using. They're also doing international trade through these, so it's not just local. They're using these particular processes. M-Pesa is certainly something that has enabled significant transition across the sort of thing, brought a whole lot of people into the sort of banked economy, enabling a whole set of different processes. We've also seen So again, to use that South African example of the, we were in the middle of the night during these crisis meetings that we were having around the sort of trying to find ways, working with local and provincial governments, trying to find ways to get food through to these communities that were without it. When non-governmental organizations and donors were providing vouchers, often for redemption at large-scale supermarkets, we were able to work with a whole lot of online groups to set up platforms through which those vouchers could be distributed digitally and connect those to informal vendors who could then serve, so that the economy and the value could be kept within the economies. So there's certainly those processes playing out. And again, the mention of the trader on the shores of Lake Victoria, they're doing those deals with buyers in Nairobi, selling their fish and transacting across that, not necessarily in large sort of farm-based farm sort of connecting, cutting out the middlemen transaction platforms. These are platforms that are sort of simplistic WhatsApp, Snapchats, and things like that. So not very sophisticated. Differently though, our work in Bangalore has found perhaps a sort of leapfrogging. But because of the tech nature of Bangalore in India, what we are seeing is that these tech companies are setting up kind of Amazon-esque kind of micro scale, connecting to a group of farmers, connecting to consumers and skipping out the supermarkets. And Thomas Reardon has written on some of this as well. So some of the work that Thomas Reardon has written is this sort of leapfrog process that is playing out and the skipping that is taking place. And our work found that as well.
And so you guys know M-Pesa is like Venmo.
Sorry.
It just occurred to me, maybe people wouldn't know what M-Pesa was, but it's essentially like Venmo. It's an app on your phone. So Stacy, I think you had your hand up, and then we'll go to Kurt.
Unless I already asked a question. If someone else wants to ask a question, please jump in.
There are no more.
I appreciated in the paper your discussion about measurement and data, but I did kind of wonder, who needs what data for what purpose? We sort of talk about this like we need more data, we need more research, but who needs what and how does that connect to policy for in this situation?
So the Angie clapping as well. I mean, this is my challenge at the moment, and with a lot of the work that we've engaged in, and particularly, and I'll use the example of the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we've had is the FAO trying to standardize measurement and work with the national governments to standardize measurement across the city, across the region. So we've been asked to ask questions that are similar to that which Namibia or Zambia or Mozambique are asking to assess their kind of attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Those questions are completely irrelevant to urban governance and urban policy making. So the knowledge that is being generated by those questions presents small-scale farmers as the most food insecure. Equally, when they use sort of proportionality to reflect that, they work in a region where the population is different, that the proportions become, it just creates a lot of problems. What we have found working within the urban areas that we work with is because food has traditionally been governed at a rural level, the levels of food security, the understanding of food supplies, etc., miss a whole set of layers around the urban food system. And again, this is not to say the rural is bad and the urban is good. It's that the urban has not necessarily had the information to effectively diagnose what the problem is and to drive concrete and applied and necessary responses to that. So what we found in the sort of many of the cities we work in is the problem is identified as there are high levels of food insecurity, so we need to grow more food. And so we see this mass rollout of urban agriculture projects on areas of land that are highly contested, where there isn't adequate kind of consideration given for irrigation, for the soil types, for the climatic conditions, etc. And so we start to see a response that doesn't necessarily align to the need. Completely disregarded is the role of the informal sector. In South Africa, because and across many other countries, because the informal sector is technically illegal, it's not measured. So understanding its impact and its role in the food system has been lost. And so when one then asks for data, the private sector is more than willing to provide data of the foods they're bringing in, the returns, etc. And so that then migrates, sort of the decisions get migrated to that space, and that starts to inform policy. And so we're starting to see sort of forms of policy that miss some of the real context of what's actually happening. And so it's about the scales of analysis. And so the point that we make, your measurement drives your diagnosis, and it's really to understand how that is playing out. And for us, it's important to understand three things, perhaps. One is it's to understand the national system and understand what's going on, but equally to understand the specificities of a particular context and the particular city and how local governance actors can make decisions in those contexts, but equally how the urban and rural connect and how those connections can be strengthened and made more resilient. So we found local producers during COVID who had always sold to other regions, but because transportation networks no one knew who they were because they weren't being counted. And so we had a whole lot of foods rotting on the fields in the periphery of the city and the peri-urban areas, because these producers had been selling into Namibia, they'd been selling elsewhere. And so how we have that level of knowledge and nuance at the local scale becomes, in our argument, an important part of policy. How the policymakers and the politicians then decide to act on that is another question altogether, but it has been around trying to do that. Hopefully, if that answers the question, and Angie's kind of comment as well around that. It's not that we need more measurement necessarily. I think it's just to try and have that specificity of measurement that enables effective decision-making in the right context, in the right space, and to equally avoid sort of the parachuting in of ideas that come from elsewhere that are often quite problematic in our contexts.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Kurt, and we're getting close to 1. So Kurt, and if we have time, we'll try to squeeze one more in.
Well, this is sort of a big can of worms, but you just sort of referenced it. So I'm curious to get your take on it. This is something I've talked with Jordan about quite a bit. But I mean, to what extent do you think supermarkets are sort of facilitating this private governance around food access and food security? Are they, do you see a benefit in some cities of certain size? Do you see other places where supermarkets are kind of undermining traditional markets, local vendors, et cetera? Or, I guess there's literature on both sides of this, and I'm curious where you come down in the context of this discussion.
So my entry point is the food insecure consumer. And I know part of the network might disagree with the framing of food security. It's useful just to use to reflect the levels of poverty and insecurity. And so, I mean, for me, for the food insecure consumer, the supermarkets have a function. They might buy those staples once a month on payday from those particular sites. In our paper, we map out the sort of purchasing profiles of different income categories. What we have found is a key component of food system resilience in the urban space. So from a kind of retail point of view, is to have multiple food access options. This might be from borrowing through building up networks with the neighbor where your child goes to play with them while you in the lean part of your pay month, and their child comes to play with you and you give them lunch, you put a few more potatoes in the stew, etc. From that level of exchange right the way through to deciding whether you go to the informal trader, you might go to one that you might ask them for credit at a certain time in the month. So having a diversity of food access options enables a far greater level of resilience in multiple periods of crisis, and in this very constrained and limited sort of economic band that most of the mildly, moderately, and severely food insecure might sit within. And so for me, the supermarkets need to be managed and curtailed in a very different way. The South African supermarkets in Zambia, as Jordan will tell you, are fundamentally changing the supply chains, and they're having to be forced to buy local sort of Zambian foods and from the Zambian farmers, because they're kind of asserting their power from a governance point of view through trade relations, international kind of mandates. The government instituted a local component. They took them to the World Trade Organization. This squabble playing out around economic value that's not necessarily benefiting anyone besides the shareholders. So we have written critiques of the food desert literature because we find this diversity of food. It's not the corner store selling pizzas and things that you might see in American town, or when I was in Canada, certainly not those sort of sugared milks and chocolate milks and those sort of things. The sort of vendors are selling fruits, they're selling all sorts of other foods that might provide a level of nutrition and access to certain foods. So they are a critical part of this, and to create a more enabling environment for the informal vendors, and they need the same level of privileging as the supermarkets get. The supermarkets do have extreme power, and not just the supermarkets, but the band above them of those fast-moving consumer goods, the Coca-Colas, the Unilevers, and everyone that feed into them. They have these global supply chains that can really do quite a lot of damage to some of the local production systems. We're all, you know, for me, I'm a middle child, so everyone needs to get along. So I'm not saying they must go and necessarily bad. I think we have seen that maybe a short answer to your question, the espoused benefits of the supermarkets do not match their claims. We are finding far greater benefit coming from a diverse, across the continuum, from highly informal street vendors selling single sort of dumplings right the way to quite sophisticated small corner stores. That diversity enables far greater response, particularly in the context of what I described around this reduced energy, this reduced access to infrastructure, and the kind of broader built environment constraints that they face. And how those constraints fluctuate over a month, over a pay cycle, mean that these processes each becomes an option at a different time of the month and a different period as well. So less supermarkets, in my view, across Africa, and they're battling. You're seeing them reducing in Kenya, you're seeing them moving out of West Africa. They're battling to compete with the sort of dynamic hustle that is going on at the moment.
Great.
Beyond the one o'clock time.
No, that's fine. Just a couple minutes. Well, thank you, everyone. And we'll stay on for a few more minutes so we can just chat more if people would like. I know I have some questions for Gareth, but thank you all so much for attending this talk today. And I hope you all have a great week.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you again, Gareth.
Great experience. Thank you.
Nice job, Mark.